Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach, and I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Michelle Manno, to talk about women in sports. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Manno is the author of Denied: Women's Sports and the Contradictions of Identity. Let's start by talking about some of the accomplishments that we've seen here, right? We've come a long way. You might say, maybe you wouldn't, you can answer that. And then we could talk about some of the things that we thought we resolved that maybe we're revisiting, and we can look at some of the issues that are just coming on the table.
Absolutely. I like starting with this because
Okay,
I feel sometimes like I can bring people down with the topic, so I appreciate starting
Okay.
with this.
We're going to make them happy.
Yeah,
first.
exactly.
Okay.
I mean, I think we see examples of progress in women's sports all over
Sure.
the place. Girls and women are playing sports more now than they ever have, and they're also showing up in sports positions like coaches, referees, all kinds of positions in sports that they were previously excluded
And even
from.
in men's sports.
Exactly,
Right,
in
yeah.
men's sports too.
Yeah.
So that's incredible progress. We've had expanding visions of what women can and should do inside and outside of sports.
Yeah.
It's not any longer unusual for women to do things like play hockey or even football in some cases.
Right.
That said, I think where we haven't come as far is when it comes to the expectations that we place upon women athletes. We still have these pretty tightly constrained expectations around the type of appearance that they should have, how they should be behaving, and those are some of the barriers that I explore in the book.
So let's start with appearance.
Yeah.
Uniforms, the way you wear your hair, masculinity, right?
Yeah.
What are the key points there?
All of those and more.
Okay, all right.
So I think first and foremost, if I can talk about why that dilemma exists.
Sure.
So sports were created by and for men, essentially, and they're perceived to be masculinizing. So when women are participating in sports,
Yeah.
they're doing things that are masculine.
So actually, that's interesting for a second. So there's no, I know this starts with the Olympic Games, if you're talking about the Olympics and all
Sure.
that. There's no example historically of women being involved in sports?
I mean, women fought to get involved in sports,
Yeah.
but they were excluded at sort of every point possible historically. They
Interesting.
certainly weren't part of the vision of who should be playing sports.
Yeah.
That was always the domain of men.
Okay.
And so we see the ramifications of that, I think, to this day.
Sure.
So when you are a woman who has expectations around femininity, for example, and
Yeah.
you're participating in a sport that is masculine, where you have to be aggressive and strong and competitive, those are not the characteristics that we think of when we think of
Right.
femininity in our society. So as a woman athlete, you're sort of butting up against this contradiction. And what that means is that you can play the sport, but you're still being held to those standards of femininity around, like you were saying,
Yeah.
how you look. So what kind of hairstyles you have, the physicality of your body, how much muscle mass you have, how you're dressing, how you're wearing your uniforms,
Yeah.
all that sort of.
Well, and if anyone thinks this is silly that we're talking about this, it's interesting if you consider that you almost never hear any of these issues coming up when we're talking about male athletes, do you?
Never. Yeah, very
Yeah.
rarely. Very
Yeah,
rarely.
so I mean, I think it's a really good place to point out that there's a huge difference here in the way we're treating people.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, something that came out in the book and something from my own experience of being an athlete is that these are pressures that women athletes are facing. So certainly there's a lot of variety across women who play sports and how they are navigating these pressures. The kind of sport you're playing matters. So I explored basketball, but the different sport contexts really make a difference as well in the kinds of pressures that we expect or that those women athletes experience.
And then on top of all the social issues is the fact that women's sports now are big business, right?
Yeah.
What are some of the pressures that brings to bear on this?
Well, I think it's mostly great. I would say.
Okay.
The reality is that if we look specifically at college basketball, women's college basketball, and
Is that the leader here? Is that the
I
thing that
think
gets the most attention?
I think in a lot of ways, yes. And I
Yeah.
think we can credit amazing athletes like Angel Reese and
Right.
Caitlin Clark, who of course are now in the WNBA, for really being, at least most recently, some of the more popular athletes that I think have brought women's sports to another level. I mean, they shattered records in terms of viewership the last 2 years in a row for the NCAA championships. And so that's really phenomenal. And yet what we see playing out in critiques of them are very similar critiques that we've seen kind of historically for women in sports. Even the most famous athletes cannot escape it.
And I mean, are we getting away from that, or is that consistent, do you think?
Well, I think there's been certainly some improvement. I will say that. I think sports, like all of our social institutions, are changing. They're becoming more progressive. We're certainly embracing a broader understanding of gender within sports. So we see in the WNBA, for example, the embracing of non-binary players. We see certainly an embracing of a broader fan base than historically was the case with the WNBA. And at the same time, we still live in a world in which all of us are constrained by the expectations around gender, around sexuality. And then those things are influenced by things like race.
I suppose if you think of it as a public sphere process almost, right? That you have to go through a period where there's more openness and more discussion, but then you're going into that with preconceptions that you had, right? And so when that openness and discussion comes, then you're going to be getting people expressing, you know,
greater visibility
anachronistic
brings
opinions about things, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
I understand there was a kind of a right-wing group that was making an argument about an athlete who wasn't getting enough credit because she was the only white member on the team or something, and so we got a lot of political things being pressed on this. What, you know, any examples of that you want to talk about?
Well, I think what's interesting about what you bring up is that people often think of sports as this kind of fun, interesting thing, when in reality, and historically this has been true, it stays true to this day, sports is a context that's rife with kind of political activism, and it intersects with all kinds of other elements of social life. And I would say specifically related to women athletes, I mean, long before Colin Kaepernick took a knee and became famous for advocating for racial justice, we had players in the WNBA doing that. And to this day, they're doing that. There's a long history of activism in sports that's very, very interesting.
What about the sense that I think some people still have that women's sports aren't the real thing? That, you know, it's sports light, right? How do you feel about that?
Well, I don't subscribe to that perspective.
Right. Okay. I didn't think you did.
I think what's interesting is to think about where that perception comes from. And again, I think we can tie it back to people think about sports as being for men. And sure, women can play them, but partly because of how we structure sports. You know, if you look just at basketball, the size of the basketball is different between men and women.
I didn't know that.
Yes. The rules are different. The distance from the three-point line to the basket is different lengths. So we sort of structure in that inequity, and then we sort of wonder, I wonder why people don't think this is the real thing. Well, in some ways it's structured to not be. And then, of course, there's ideas of what is exciting and interesting. I think what people like about a sport like basketball is it's fast-paced. In men's sports, you see a lot of dunking, a lot of things like that, that women are not yet doing as much. Of course, we do have athletes like Brittany Griner, who can and does dunk. But I think that does contribute, again, to what we think of as exciting, and we attach that to men's sports.
Well, you know, and it's not like this is a new thing. I mean, if you look at boxing, in wrestling, they've always had weight limits, right? And so, you know, would somebody say that the lightweight champion isn't as good a boxer as the heavyweight champion because the heavyweight champion has longer arms and, you know, can punch harder? So, and actually some of them actually proved that they were just as good by stepping up a rank, and I think Floyd Patterson did that. So how is this? How does this play out? I mean, at some point, do you think we're going to be more accepting of this? Do you see? more resistance than you would expect at this point?
Time will tell. I mean, I
Yeah.
think I have to say, I was surprised. From the time I was an athlete all the way up to when I was doing this research, I thought, there's no way I'm going to see the same things that I experienced with contemporary athletes, and I was wrong.
Yeah.
I did experience it. Now, it looked different. The way the athletes navigated it was different, but we saw some of these enduring patterns of inequity. And so I think, unfortunately, we have a lot of work to do when it comes to that. But as we talked about earlier, I think increased visibility, increased interest in women's sports, people's willingness to have this conversation is only going to be good.
How do you feel about the fact that more people are watching men's sports than women's sports?
Well, I think it depends on which sport.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Like which?
Well, for example, I think women's college basketball is more popular now, and in some cases it has higher viewership. But again, I think we still in our culture think about sports as men mostly play it and men mostly watch it.
Right.
And until that changes a little bit, I think then our kind of broader societal perceptions won't change.
So let's look at the language of sports here for a minute.
Sure.
Given that this has been a sort of a male domain, right? One of the derogatory terms that's used often in sports is to compare a male athlete to a woman, to say, you're playing like a girl, you're a sissy, a wuss, right?
Yeah.
Are we, we doing anything about that? Are we moving away from that? I think this has come up a few times.
Yeah.
Recently here.
I think we are. So I'll say broadly, I think that we are moving away from the style of coaching in which we see what I would call abusive language as motivating. The example I like to bring up, we're here in Indiana, Bobby Knight. The Bobby Knight style of coaching, I think today is less acceptable than it was in the past. And of course, I'm using a kind of extreme example. We're not talking about throwing chairs.
I just want to note he was IUN, not Purdue.
Yes, fair, yes, important distinction. That said, I think we certainly still see the use of feminizing language to police boys and men into being masculine, and that's what those words are used for. You don't say to a boy, "You're playing like a girl," to give them a compliment. You say that to make them angry, because the assumption is there's nothing worse in sports than to play like a girl, and we can really trouble what the kind of foundation of that assumption is. I think those types of words, they really are designed to remind people that our gender is attached to expectations for how we behave, and to be a girl, to play like a girl, is presumed to be not being tough, not being competitive enough, not being aggressive, strong, all the things you need to do well in sports.
What are some other informal rules that are, still influencing things that maybe are problematic?
Well, in the context I looked at in women's basketball and women's sports generally, I think there's a lot of informal rules around the policing of sexuality. So it's certainly still true today that we stereotype women athletes as being lesbian or gay almost inherently as a function of participating in sports. Now, the type of sport matters a lot there. So team and contact sports like basketball have that stereotype more than sports like volleyball or more individual sports like tennis.
And why do you think that is?
I think it has to do with what's required of athletes in those sports. It's also, you mentioned earlier, the uniforms. Basketball players don't wear tennis skirts. They're not wearing spandex, the kind of more feminized clothing. I think that contributes to the notions of the stereotype. Also, a basketball player, they're going to be taller, they're probably going to be bigger, they're going to have more muscles, right? The sport requires different things, and that also contributes to the stereotype. So there's, I think, rules associated around that, and that goes back to what we were talking about before, which is, okay, if I have these assumptions about me as an athlete, then I'm going to have to do things to prove to people that I'm not what they think I am. So maybe I'll put makeup on, maybe I'll make sure my hair is done a certain way before a game, so I can balance out these perceptions of me as masculine with my performance of femininity.
Right. Whereas the male athlete is just thinking about getting ready for the game.
Probably.
The female athlete has got to contend with the perceptions.
Yeah, an argument I make in the book is that a lot of these things are happening subconsciously. They're not necessarily before the game thinking, well, I really need to make sure that I've shaved my legs.
Although some people might.
Some people are
They might,
certainly,
yeah.
especially in
If
those
they've been
moments.
taking criticism, especially, right?
Yes, yes. But also a lot of how gender operates in our lives is this sort of, it feels natural and it feels normal. And so that's why I think we also have to kind of call attention because, a lot of times we don't even realize we're doing it.
Yeah, I think of hairstyles as an interesting comparison here. I mean, men are wearing any kind of hairstyle you can imagine, especially football players, I think. But there's pressures, I think, on women athletes, aren't there?
Certainly. So this goes back to lesbian stereotyping, which I talk about. So certainly short hair versus long hair, and then racialized hairstyles as well. So athletes talked about if they had a fade or if they had their hair in braids or certainly cornrows, dreadlocks, those sorts of things are going to be perceived as more masculine than the long ponytail hairstyles. So that's really there about the intersection of gender and race operating in really interesting ways.
Some of the women athletes have been sort of a flashpoint for some of these issues here. I think of Brittany Griner. Can you talk a little bit about her?
Yes, so we could have a whole other show about Brittany Griner.
Okay, well, let's do that. Let's do that.
Yeah. I mean, Brittany Griner, first of all, for those who are unfamiliar, one of the best college women's basketball players ever, Olympic champion, WNBA star, just phenomenal athlete.
Yeah.
For her entire career, she has experienced tremendous vitriol, mostly online, but not exclusively, for her gender performance. So she's really tall, she presents more masculine, she identifies as queer, she sort of embodies all these things we're talking about and has time and again had to face criticisms for how she shows up as a woman athlete.
So like, how would somebody, where do these criticisms come from and how are they expressing them?
I mean, unfortunately, we see a lot of it come through social media.
Yeah.
I think you see a lot of trolling of Brittany Griner online, a lot of questioning her, whether she is in fact a woman, talking about her in derogatory ways, comparing her to kind of animalistic imagery, which is very reminiscent of historically, I think, how we have kind of collectively talked about Black people in particular. So, I mean, it really is kind of your sort of run-of-the-mill racism and misogyny and homophobia kind of coalescing into
What a
these
terrible
critiques.
thing to be an accomplished athlete and somehow be the focal point of all of this repressed anxiety and hate and anger, right?
It is a lot to navigate, in addition to being...
Especially for her.
Especially for her,
And people know her because she was detained, but that had nothing to do with any of this, right? Is that...
I mean, her detention was around alleged possession of drugs, which was not connected to her identity specifically, but she has talked about, and she has a memoir out about this, she has talked about and there was a lot of public concern about her existing in a Russian prison in which the country is notably anti-LGBTQ. And of course, she is, again, somebody who kind of presents gender non-normatively.
But let's go to the Olympics. Walk me through some of the issues that came up in the Olympics in 2024.
Yes, well, I think the biggest issue that connects to the book is Imani Khalif, who is an Algerian boxer, kind of most notably, I should start with, who won gold and did a really phenomenal performance, but did not do so without criticism, so experienced a tremendous amount of criticism, again, of her gender performance. She received critiques for appearing to be too masculine, and then many people then questioning if she was in fact a man. And when I mean many people, I'm talking, not just about your run-of-the-mill stranger online. I'm talking about people like Elon Musk, people like J.K. Rowling, Donald Trump, even a number of people.
I get Musk and Trump. How does Rowling get involved in
J.K.
this?
Rowling is sort of historically known for her anti-trans rhetoric, and she was tweeting about Imani Khalif actually spreading false information that Imani Khalif is a trans woman boxer, when in fact she's not trans. She's a cisgender woman who happens to look more masculine than J.K. Rowling would like her to be, and so started to spread lies about her online that then picked up a lot of traction elsewhere, unfortunately. Yeah.
And some other examples from the Olympics?
I mean, I think we have other boxers who can fall into this, and then the Olympics, I think, are sort of notorious in some ways for the sort of ways in which we've historically excluded other women athletes. And I talk in the book about Caster Semenya in particular, who is a runner who is no longer allowed to compete in the Olympic Games because her testosterone levels are too high for what the International Olympic Committee considers to be appropriate for women. So we see lots of examples of this.
Now to some extent, our reaction to these things is influenced by history of the Soviet Union, the Iron Curtain countries, modifying their athletes using drugs and things like that. So there's that legacy here. I think that spills into this a little bit, doesn't it, or not?
I think it does in some ways, but what's really different about this is that these aren't testosterone, sure, you could argue is a performance-enhancing drug, but if it's come by naturally, in terms of we all have different natural levels of it, then I think it's a little bit different, right? These are athletes who are simply spending their lives, in many cases, training to get to the highest level possible, and then being excluded because, and most of the time, they're being excluded because somebody perceives them to be non-normatively gendered, and then it leads to a whole host of investigations and things like that.
Of course, I realize that's the case, but I wonder if it doesn't have, for people who aren't really thinking this through, right? If they're just not tapping into that connotative, reference to those kinds of things in the past.
Well, certainly, I think this idea of fairness that comes in, and that's I think what connects to the examples of historically you were talking about is we think about fairness in these really particular ways, and then that intersects with things like gender and sexuality and race and all kinds of things.
So we talked about the reaction to some of this on social media. What about the mainstream media? What about ESPN and?
Yeah, I think the mainstream media, sometimes they're managing these issues well. They're covering them accurately. I know there's also been examples of the media not doing a great job, so also contributing to misinformation about these athletes. And then I think there's the broader context of in what ways are we encouraging the media to give more coverage to women's sports as a way to contribute to greater equity across men's and women's sports.
Yeah, I remember when they were using Jimmy the Greek to comment on odds on sports events and stuff, and he said some derogatory things about African Americans, and he was pulled immediately. And I think it was the last we ever saw of him. Are there any examples of things like that regarding women's sports that you can think
sure.
of?
I mean, this was a little while ago now, but Don Imus,
that's
shock jock
right.
radio
And he was talking
host.
about a girls' basketball team, wasn't he?
So he made some racist and sexist comments about the Rutgers women's basketball program, specifically in comparison to, at that time, the Tennessee women's basketball program. He used some derogatory language, and then there's been a number of commentators over the years who have commented specifically on Serena and Venus Williams, also invoking kind of racist and sexist language in relation to them, and there's been various types of backlash in those cases.
So you're a Ph.D. In sociology from Emory University. Looked at social inequality. I imagine that was your dissertation to some extent. So what got you interested in this?
Oh gosh, I like to say that I started writing this book when I was 8, which is a little bit of a joke, but that's when I started playing basketball. And really my interest in this topic stems from my own experience as an athlete, specifically in college when I was experiencing some of these things for the first time. When you're younger, you have a little bit more flexibility. It's not unusual for girls to be tomboys.
Yeah,
right?
right.
As you get older, though, those expectations change, and I was experiencing that. I was also coming out at the same time, so there was a lot going on for me personally around gender and sexuality. And then I went to grad school, and I started to dive into all of the research around gender in sports, and I was really curious to explore it from a research perspective. So here I am. I mean, that's the cool thing, is that even so, sports, when they're at their best, right, they provide us with these opportunities to have fun, to meet people that we never would otherwise, and to be healthy in all kinds of ways.
Very good. That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Michelle Manno for joining me on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. See you next time.